All right, well, welcome all of you to another edition of the ISPP Asia Pacific Virtual Seminar Series. This week we'll be hearing from Seanon Wong. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Government and Public Administration here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He's also the director of the International Affairs Research Center here. And his research interests, well, I'd like to say first, he's a fellow political psychologist because we're pretty rare here, but his research interests also include international relations theory, security studies, diplomacy, and identity and intergroup conflicts. So with no further ado, let me turn the floor over to Seanon Wong.
Okay, thank you very much. I trust that you can all see my PowerPoint. Yeah, Okay, good. All right, so first of all, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm really thankful for to the organizers for inviting me. And I'm not saying this just out of customs. I really mean it for a couple of reasons. First of all, my background is more in international relations, IR theory, security studies. I have an interest in political psychology, but whatever political psychology material I use in my research, I've done it pretty much on a self-taught basis. So the meeting here is, I would really appreciate, the opportunity here to basically present my research to basically a group of people who know about the psychological literature than me. So I really look forward to getting your feedback. This is a really good opportunity for me to achieve that. The second reason is that this is a project that I've been working on really just on and off in the last year or two. And usually if I have a new project, I would just, as I'm sure that's the case for most of you, you would go out and test your ideas to audiences in workshops and conferences, right? But given COVID, right, I haven't been presenting much in the last 2 years. So I've really been just like working on this pretty much on my own, save for like presenting this once or twice in the last couple of months. So again, I really treasure this opportunity to collect feedback, to pick your brains, so to speak. Okay, so let me put out my notes. Okay, so again, this is something that's more or less work in progress. And let me begin with an observation, okay? A certain disconnect that I often see exists between, on the one hand, some of the things we learn in my home discipline of IR, international relations, and on the other hand, how the world allegedly works or seem to work sometimes. So there's a certain disconnect between theory and empirics. Now, on the one hand, I'd argue that in much of IR, it is generally assumed that whenever a country suffers a loss in an international conflict, its meaning is straightforward and known to its people. They know without much ambiguity who's the winner, who's the loser, but more importantly, how to feel about the experience. And here I define a loss broadly. It could be a country's wholesale defeat in a war, or it could be some event or episode that has happened in the course of a conflict that would by itself be seen as a defeat, a retreat, a setback, or at least some sort of failure. So for instance, when in 2012, Barack Obama publicly declared that the use of chemical weapons would be the red line the Syrian government must not cross in its civil war, but it later crossed anyway, and Obama did nothing about it. We would say that Obama had retreated from this threat, and that was indeed, and that he had failed to, in his effort to deter the Syrians. Obama, in this case, lost, and that was indeed how many Americans and his critics saw it back then. There's always a lag in my PowerPoint. I have no idea. It's not even responding. Okay. Now, this assumption, right, the assumption that winning or losing is a relatively clear-cut concept or idea of belief is in fact a very, very fundamental, right, to a wide range of research in IR. For instance, there's a prolific literature on what's known as audience cost theory, which argues, among other things, that as in the case of Obama, right, a leader who retreats from a threat would be subject to punishment by his own people. But this theory, to a certain extent, makes sense, right? Only if his people, a leader's people, know a retreat when they see it, or more importantly, they feel it as such, as a retreat. This assumption is also built into what is often called the diversionary theory of war. The theory suggests that leaders who have troubles, who are having troubles at home, would be inclined, and that's something some people are attributing to what's Putin doing in Ukraine, for instance, right? They would be inclined, because of some trouble at home, they would be inclined to initiate or escalate a conflict abroad, because according to one rationalist strand of the theory, his domestic standing would improve if he wins the conflict. But again, this logic makes sense only if we assume that his people can have an objective understanding of whether he is leading them to victory or instead leading them to defeat. However, if we look at the empirical record, the perception of winning and losing is often more malleable. People's feeling of winning and losing, much like how you may be seeing the head of a rabbit or a duck in this picture, can be subject to manipulation. A loss can be so-called spun, right, by those who have the incentive to do so, meaning those in power, right, into something that sometimes feels less like a loss. In more extreme cases, it could even feel like a victory. So let me give you some examples. Okay, the PowerPoint is, okay, right. All right, so let me give some examples. Evacuation at Dunkirk. So the evacuation of Allied forces, right, from the beaches and harbor in Dunkirk in 1940 was really an ignominious retreat. So as Winston Churchill said it at the time, very bluntly, wars are not won by evacuations. Still, that did not prevent leaders since then from spinning it into something that feels more like a win. And so as two observers once wrote, even military defeats can be perceived as victories. Dunkirk is in itself was a success, thousands of soldiers escaped, but the drama focused attention away from the wider picture, a disastrous military defeat for Britain and France, really in the face of advancing Nazi forces, right? And Dunkirk was not an exception. So consider India's war with India's war with China in 1962. India very much lost that war, right? But still, that didn't stop people from trying to portray it as its final retreat as something admirable, something glorious, something virtuous. As a major Indian newspaper opined at the time, quote, if Dunkirk has gone down in history as the best example of British courage and determination in the face of the greatest odds, the planned withdrawal of several dozen Indian Jawans and officers will surely be regarded by future historians as a great page in military history. And just 2 years ago, Armenia had clearly lost its war with Azerbaijan. And this would be a very difficult case to spin, to present Armenia's stunning defeat as anything but a defeat. But that did not prevent its prime minister from at least trying. So the first thing he did was after the war, after he basically conceded defeat, was to go onto Facebook and declare publicly, quote, this is not a victory, but there is no defeat until you find yourself defeated. We will never recognize ourselves as losers, and this should be the beginning of our era of national unification and rebirth. We fought to the end and we will win. So examples such as these show that in the aftermath of a conflict, governments and their domestic allies, such as their fellow partisans and sympathetic members of the press and media, often try to alleviate or even reverse their citizens' sense of loss through propaganda. But how can that be done, and how is that achieved exactly? Now, before we answer these questions, we need to answer something, I guess, more fundamental, which is what determines a citizen's perception of winning and losing, I guess in IR, but also generally in life. Well, there is indeed a literature in IR that has provided some answers. However, I argue that the answers that the literature has provided has really only given us half the picture, because they're based on what I call the cognitive rational model of win-loss perception. What this means is that judgments about winning and losing involves some rational assessment of whether certain goals or aims have been achieved. Say, for instance, taking over a disputed piece of land or forcing an opponent to back down, and whether such goals or aims have been achieved with reasonable means at some reasonable cost. It is also cognitive, right? Hence cognitive rational model, which I call cognitive because this assessment is not automatic. It is not predetermined. It is a process and outcome of learning and updating of beliefs based on the information that comes in as a conflict unfolds. So for instance, it is often assumed that the average citizen does not care or is knowledgeable enough about foreign policy to always have an informed opinion. He therefore relies on cues from those who are in a better position to pass a judgment, such as other leaders in the government, leaders in the opposition, the media, etc. These cues can also come from outside international actors. So for instance, if a government fails to follow through with a threat to use force, but opposition leaders sort of agree that that's the right thing to do, or that the use of force is not endorsed by the UN Security Council, etc., then backing down would be more sensible and considered less of a retreat or a defeat than if any of these conditions were absent. Or it could be that a citizen has been provided, or citizens have been provided with new information, right, about the substance of the government's policy or the viability of alternative policies to achieve the same goals and aims. So for instance, the government may argue and provide evidence that persisting or insisting with a threat or a military offensive or not conceding would actually harm the national interest, or that the cost of not using would be too high, or that some policy alternatives such as imposing economic sanctions instead of using force have become available or are better as options, as an alternative response. Or that some third party like the UN or I don't know, like some other third countries have offered to mediate the conflict. Backing down under any of these conditions would make sense and therefore be less seen as a loss. Or the government might try to reset the agenda, to reframe and reprioritize the goals and aims for the conflict, emphasizing those it has succeeded and downplaying those it has failed. So for instance, when the US pulled out of Afghanistan last year, a common narrative the Biden administration and others promoted was that American objective had always been to rid the country of terrorists and who could harm America. They were not there for state building or promoting democracies, since they've accomplished what they now claim they've always set out to do. They've won rather than lost the war in Afghanistan. Finally, and this is perhaps especially true in the authoritarian context, the government can simply withhold information that otherwise shines a bad light on the country's performance in the conflict. So for instance, when Chinese and Indian troops clashed in the Himalayas in June 2020, the Chinese government was silent about the casualties and censored discussions of it domestically. It only acknowledged almost over a year later that it suffered 4 casualties, which we know probably isn't true. The number should be larger, it's probably larger than that. Or 3 years earlier in 2017, after the standoff between, again, India and China at Doklam, and the Chinese government did not disclose to its own people the fact that it had pulled out the troops and construction equipment stationed in the disputed area that sparked the standoff, the crisis to begin with. So without this crucial piece of information, that is, Chinese forces had actually retreated, the belief that China had prevailed over India rather than the other way around became easier to sell to the Chinese people in their cognitive assessment rational assessment of what has just happened, right? But however, I argue that the feeling of winning, and this is something I think we can all experience in our everyday life, right? Is not only cognitive rational, it is also psychological, social psychological. If it's concerned about like some kind of contest, some kind of competition, conflict between two groups, right? It involves the experience of elevated or deflated collective self-esteem as a citizen of a country, that is, in the language of social psychology, as a member of the national in-group, vis-a-vis the out-group, meaning the adversary in question. So let me elaborate, right? According to the APA's definition, collective self-esteem refers to, quote, individuals' subjective assessment of that portion of their self-concept that is based on their membership in social groups, such as families, teams, or schools, as well as on categories that have psychological significance for them, such as being a member of a certain race, ethnicity, or nationality, right? So in other words, an individual's collective self-esteem is how he feels about himself, his reputation, honor, status, self-worth, etc., not for being himself per se, right, but for being a member of a certain social group. And I argue there's a lot of that going on too when one's group loses or wins a conflict in IR, in international politics, but also certainly in other realms of social life. So let me give you some simple examples, right, to clarify how the perception of winning versus losing can have both a cognitive, rational, and a social psychological component, and how they are in theory distinct, right? So to use a sports example, right? I'm not a sports person, and I'm not a fan of any sports team. In fact, I hardly do sports, but that's another issue. But for the purpose of making money, right, I could still place a bet on, say, a match between the Manchester United and Liverpool. And if I bet on the Manchester United winning, but it loses, I know in my cognitive rational assessment of what just happened, the outcome, how much I've invested, how much I've bet on, the odds of winning, losing, etc., that I failed to achieve my objective. And not only that, I actually lost money, right? On the other hand, it could be that I'm not betting or gambling on anything, but I am a huge fan. I'm a diehard fan of the Manchester United. And being a fan of the football team is part of my social identity. So when it loses a match against Liverpool, its most significant outgroup because of the long-term rivalry, I feel bad, right? I experience lower collective self-esteem. Again, not for being myself, but for being a fan, for being a member, identifying with the sports team, right? On the contrary, Liverpool fans would be elated, right? They feel pride, they would experience higher collective self-esteem. And of course, I'm not just making this up. I'm sure many of you know, right? This is actually a very well documented phenomenon in the study of intergroup relations in social psychology. And going back to IR, right? The same distinction can be made, say, in audience cost theory's explanations for why a leader might be subject to punishment if he concedes from a threat. It could be because backing down would, in his people's cognitive rational assessment, lead to some actual material loss, such as concessions on whatever that's being fought over, or that backing down would mean failing to achieve certain important objectives. The leader should therefore be held accountable. He is incompetent. He should no longer be the leader, right? Or on the other hand, right, it could also be because from a social psychological point of view, backing down would, so as James Fearon put it in his seminal article from 1994 that sort of jump-started the research audience cost, would lead to a, quote, loss of credibility, face, or honor. In other words, self-esteem for the country, for the in-group. Now, I've explained how governments may remedy, right, and their domestic allies, right, might try to remedy their citizens' perception of loss from a cognitive, rational perspective. The question from a social psychological point of view then is, could they somehow achieve the same by mitigating or even reversing the harm done to their people's esteem, like after a loss, after defeat, after a retreat? As I'm sure many of you know, scholars of social identity theory and psychology have actually been asking and answering this question for quite some time. And what I'm hoping to accomplish here with this current project is to incorporate their insights into the study of IR, right? Particularly in this case, the perception of victory and loss. So what do we know? We know that people, including you and me, right, engage all the time in what are known as social creative strategies, right, concerning our group identity, right, to make ourselves feel better, to maintain a healthy level of collective self-esteem. So as Tetchell and Turner explained, right, social creative strategies are strategies whereby, quote, group members seek positive distinctions for the in-group by redefining or altering elements of the comparative situation with the out-group. So returning to the context of international politics, what this means is that if a loss or a defeat or a retreat or some setback for country A against country B is a so-called current, quote, like element of the comparative situation that makes the citizens of country A to experience lower self-esteem, then this harm could, in theory, be dampened, if not even reversed, right? If people's attention can be drawn elsewhere to some different, quote, like elements of the comparative situation that would, in comparison, right, make a country A look not as bad or even good, right? And I argue that such strategies are ubiquitous. After all, no one likes to feel like a loser, and governments certainly do not want their people to feel like losers, right? They have the incentive to prevent that from happening. And metaphorically, I guess, and perhaps just to make this project more catchy, I've labeled these strategies altogether the IQ theory of esteem management. So for those of you who know something about modern Chinese literature, the name refers to the title character in this satirical novella, The True Story of IQ by Lu Xun, an early 20th century Chinese writer. So in the novella, IQ is a lowly peasant from rural China, a loser in life in practically everything he does in life, right? He nevertheless always manages to concoct and make up in his mind a sense of what Lu Xun calls like spiritual victory. Victory that is subjectively felt rather than achieved based on some objective, cognitive, rational measure of success. And now in my close reading of the social psychological literature, right, I have identified 10 of such strategies, right, that would go into this theory, and I label these strategies from S1 to S10, and I think these are particularly relevant to IR. So in the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to show you how these strategies were put to use, okay, in a number of historical anecdotes from all over the world, but also along the way with a case study on how the Chinese government managed its people's sense of loss in the immediate aftermath of Japan's so-called nationalization of the disputed Diaoyu Senkaku Islands in September 2012. Particular attention will be given to the themes and narratives expressed in the editorials of the two major state-owned and very influential state-owned newspapers, the People's Daily, Review About, and Global Times, Huangzhou Shibao. Now, just to give you a brief background of the incident, so as I'm sure some or many of you would remember, this simmering dispute between the two countries came to a boil in 2012. A lot of things happened that year before then in the first half of the year, but the climax of their confrontation came when Tokyo proceeded with its so-called purchase of the islands from their alleged private owners on September 11th. The incident, in fact, could hardly be more humiliating for the Chinese, not the least because of the hardline stance the government have shown during the run up to it, and also the nationalistic frenzy the government itself has whipped up in the days leading it to the purchase. So, for instance, the Chinese President Hu Jintao warned the Japanese Prime Minister against the move in person just 2 days before. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a strongly worded warning just the day before. And the state-owned newspapers themselves trumpeted some of the most hardline threats in their editorials. So as Jessica Wise put it, quote, the timing, so Jessica Wise is a professor of Chinese IR, I think currently at Yale, at Cornell. She puts it, right, the timing of the purchase was seen as a major blow and a loss of face for China's leaders. So in situations like this, how can a government, or more generally, right, this I will explain with my other anecdotes, right? What can a government do to manage the damage done to their people's esteem? So first, I argue that a government may try to reverse the failure associated with the loss, the setback, transforming it from something bad into something desirable, right? So in other words, it spins it into something laudable. So the Allies' retreat at Dunkirk and India's defeat during the Sino-Indian War, I discussed like half an hour ago or 15 minutes ago, would be two of such examples. Second, a government may try to redirect popular attention from the loss or the defeat or the retreat to another dimension of comparison with the out group that is more favorable to the in group. So for instance, in sports, plenty of research has shown that when a team is losing, say Manchester United again losing to Liverpool, right? Its fans, again, so these are people who identify with it as an in group, would tend to focus on an attribute, right? Or some other dimension, or what psychologists would call a dimension of comparison that is less relevant to performance, right? Such as the belief that the opposing team has played dirty or that its fans are arrogant, right? So basically they move their attention away from the fact that they've lost to some other dimensions. It could be made up, it could be real, that would shed a more positive light on themselves. And this is similar. This is what was done immediately after Japan's purchase of the islands. The Chinese state media went all out highlighting other dimensions of comparison, right? That would make the Chinese in-group glow. So, for instance, just 2 days after the purchase, the People's Daily featured on its front page, a very front page, multiple articles that glorified China in a range of achievements that matter as great power, aerospace technology and missions, deep sea research, quantum communications. The emphasis of these articles was not only on like how far China has come in these dimensions per se, but how it was leading the race against its global competitors, including Japan. Right? And 2 more days later, a Global Times editorial assured that notwithstanding the setback, China had actually already won, right, in other ways in the Diaoyu Islands. So first, it argued, right, Japan was the veritable instigator. It had lost in reason. China, therefore, had already won. So actually using the framing it in the language of winning and losing, won in terms of being reasonable. Second, the Chinese people are high in morale and seeking revenge. The Japanese have far lower morale. They feel anxious. China therefore had already won in posture. Third, China could deploy its resources in Northeast Asia to confront China. By contrast, Japan had the most opponents in the region. China had therefore already won forcefully in strategy. So to me, it's interesting how, again, the language is coached, right, explicitly in terms of winning and losing. So the government clearly wanted its people to see themselves as the winner, despite being just slapped in the face by Japan. The next two social creative strategies, so S3 and S4, enhance an in-group's collective self-esteem by degrading the adversary and occasionally other relevant outgroups. So first, like government propaganda may what is often called like blast at the adversary, recasting it as unworthy of comparison with the in-group. It derogates the out-group by calling it names, insulting, slandering, and dehumanizing it. Second, a government may redirect the public's attention to other outgroups of a lower status for a more positive downward comparison. So anecdotally, for those of you who, if there's anyone here from China, you might have heard this before. So there's a long-standing joke among mainland Chinese about how propaganda works on state television, right? During its nightly 30-minute news broadcast, Seanon Wong, right? The joke is that 10 minutes are always spent, the first 10 minutes are always spent on reporting how well off Chinese people are, followed by always another 10 minutes of how miserable, poor, and disaster-stricken many parts of the world have been, right? So such would be an example of a positive downward comparison. So that, I guess, in a way, the Chinese government certainly knows how to make its people feel good about themselves. And indeed, in the immediate aftermath of Japan's purchase of the Diaoyu Islands, propaganda was relentless at blasting at Japan. China's status was also elevated through incidental comparisons with other quote-unquote lesser outgroups, particularly in this case, the Philippines and Vietnam. So insults, nicknames, and derogatory metaphors were rampant. The Global Times, for instance, opined that with the Chinese saying, "Kill the chicken, scare the monkey," Japan was just volunteering to be the chicken. It wrote the next day, "Japan is only a play puppet of the US, and play puppets are cheap like the Philippines." The difference between these two countries, meaning Japan and the Philippines, is just one of a small Barbie versus a big Barbie. For China, the Diaoyu Islands conflict is just a game of beating the dogs in front of their master. Even Russia may one day extend its hands and toy with Japan a little bit. The newspaper also used repeatedly the derogatory slang "Little Japan" to refer to Japan. It editorialized that the country should be dismissed as Asia's unruly rebel. And if anyone here who speaks Chinese and have a better translation for Yao Ming, let me know. I spent like an hour trying to look for the best translation. China would fix Zhen, right? So in Chinese is Zhen. It's a very insulting way of saying things. Zhen, right? It will fix it whenever needed, but it should not be too psychologically hung up on it, right? In another article, the newspaper called Japan a small neighbor that's not quite worth the attention, a nuisance, just another Vietnam or just another Philippines. So while the two strategies I just discussed work, right, by degrading the outgroup, the next two strategies work in the opposite direction. They aggrandize the in-group. So instead of being something bad, a loss may be portrayed as compliance with some desirable norms or standards held by an even larger group reference, usually the international community. The basis of comparison is as such shifted away from the in-group. So for instance, again, moving away from China temporarily, right? So that would be the psychological rationale behind, just an example here, like behind Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's attempt to justify his decision to halt missiles built up in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He once proclaimed right? In the good, in the greater good, in the name of the greater good of humanity, quote, in order to save the world, we must retreat, right? And in the case of China, as Kai Kwek and Ian Johnson have shown in a recent article in International Security, like Chinese respondents in a survey experiment who are, quote, reminded, right, that the Chinese are inherently a quote, peace-loving people, or more forgiving of their government for retreating in an international crisis. And again, that was indeed a theme repeatedly invoked during the Diaoyu Island dispute. The government's peaceful handling of the crisis was depicted as praiseworthy, not only by its own evaluation, but also, according to its propaganda, and very importantly from a social psychological point of view, right, in the eyes of others, right? So on September 14th, for instance, so 3 days after the purchase, the People's Daily opined that China had always followed a policy of friendliness and partnership with its neighbors. China's peaceful development had driven regional development. Its fine international image cannot be altered. Next, government propaganda may try to recategorize the in-group upward, right, into an alternative in-group of high status, and in doing so to enable members of the in-group to so-called bask in this new identity. And again, this was evident also in the dispute with Japan. So the argument here was, if there was any reason for the Chinese to feel inferior before, the People's Daily and Global Times claimed, they could now look down on their long-term arch rival. Japan is no longer, even as the saying goes, I guess, in the same league. So for instance, the readers were repeatedly reminded that China is part of the world's nuclear club, while Japan is not. Another message that came up time and again was how China had surged ahead in power. So for instance, the Global Times wrote on September 18th, China has become a country that could destroy Japan. However, in the current crisis, China demonstrated the maturity and reasonableness expected of a truly great power. It won the respect and recognition of the international society. It assigned the psychology, the newspaper continued 10 days later for the Chinese people to rebuild their sense of psychological superiority over Japan. But I guess perhaps most interestingly, the government was explicit about its intention to demobilize its citizens through upward, very paradoxically, right, through upward recategorization. So in a way, turning audience cost theory on its head, people were actually discouraged from taking their anger to the streets because such behavior was contrary to their newfound membership or identity among the world's great powers, right? It's for those of us coming from an IR background, that's sort of like counterintuitive to how we are taught, are accustomed to think about audience cost theory, right? Going out to the street is actually showing that you're inferior, right? So for instance, the Global Times editorialized on September 18th that protests were once an expression of a China that was frail and weak. They have become a habit, but the page should now be turned because China is already a great power. Look at the Americans. They do not protest in the street against foreign countries, only citizens of small powers and weak powers, and here explicitly mentioned those in the Middle East, right, protest because it is the only means they have. The Chinese people's reaction to foreign affairs should therefore transform to one more suited to a great power, strong power. Now, the 6 social creative strategies I've discussed so far, again, just a brief recap, right? They work by either defining, redefining, or altering the identity of the outgroup, or the in-group itself, or the dimension of or issue upon which the two groups are being compared. The next 3 strategies I'm going to discuss are different. They bolster an in-group's collective self-esteem by altering its reference in time and making sense of what's happening, of the current loss or the current retreat. So first, government propaganda may lead its people to imagine a future that is optimistic, perhaps unduly optimistic vis-a-vis the outgroup. So as the German scholar and historian Wolfgang Schulverbusch once wrote, quote, "Nations do not usually embrace defeat in their mythology. They do everything in their power to deny it or to turn the tables by imagining the victor as the loser of the next round of warfare." So in fact, his observation applies really just as well in other aspects of life. Right? So for instance, there's plenty of research in psychology that have shown when a competitive sports team loses a match, to make themselves feel better, its players and supporters are often quick to exaggerate the probability of winning against the opposing team in the future. Or as we discussed earlier, that would be what the Armenian prime minister was trying to do when he proclaimed in the aftermath of its war with Azerbaijan, "We will win," even though there might not be any material basis for that kind of claim. And similarly, in the Diaoyu Island dispute, one of the first things Chinese propaganda did was to assure its people of a very bright future. So the Global Times wrote in just a span of several days passages like, "China's economy will double that of Japan soon, triple, quadruple, or more. With China growing more powerful by the day, losing the islands is impermissible. In the end, Japan will certainly be the first to budge. Just wait and see," right? So the temporal meaning here, the temporal implication here is very obvious. Just wait and see. China will certainly make the Japanese look bad. It will give them a direct blow to the head. The next social creative strategy would be from a temporal time perspective, right? The opposite of what I just discussed. So instead of looking into the future, a government could direct popular attention away, right, from the current loss to how the in-group has fared against the out-group in the past. So it resorts to what social psychologists call like temporal comparisons to achieve a higher collective self-esteem. So a very recent example would be how the Chinese media referenced repeatedly, really just pretty much every day, the country's resistance against the Americans in the Korean War some 70 years ago, and its ongoing trade war with the US. And similarly, in the days after Japan's nationalization of the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands in 2012, the Chinese media was keen to remind its people again over and over and over again how China had beaten Japan in World War II. Next, a government may also try to reduce the significance of the current loss, the current retreat, right, the humiliation, right, by contextualizing this particular episode, right, over a longer period of time. Okay, so anecdotally, when U.S. President Donald Trump unexpectedly imposed a steep increase in tariffs against Japanese imports in May 2019, the Global Times editor-in-chief, Hu Xijing, basically consult his readers by reminding them how the setback was only just a small case. 小事所事一宗, pardon my Mandarin, with many more cases of success in the 5 millennia of Chinese history. Right? And that was also the message the Chinese government attempted to spread, again, almost daily in the aftermath of Japan's purchase of the islands. a broader perspective. Basically, the message was a broader perspective of history was important, it was required. The Chinese people should not be too hung up on what's going on now, what's only been a major setback, a bump in the road in a very grander scheme of things. So contrary to the state-owned newspapers' belligerent rhetoric before the purchase, it would now be wise actually not to respond too forcefully, because the payoff down the road will be even bigger and more certain. So for instance, on the day of Japan's purchase, the Global Times stated that China's long-term objective, again, there's a very clear agenda of resetting the temporal reference of people, right? The long-term objective should be to assert de facto control of the islands. Therefore, there was no need to be angry, agitated. Now is not the best time to solve the problem once and for all. The Diaoyu Islands cannot run. The islands will one day be safely in China's pocket. In the course of reclaiming the islands, China's old-time rival, meaning Japan, will be subdued. It involves a process, right? So, right, recontextualizing. It's a process. And more effort was made in the subsequent days to convince the Chinese people to be more farsighted. The People's Daily wrote on September 7th that China should be ready to fight a protracted war. Time is on China's side. It added the following day. The Global Times echoed this viewpoint days later. The dispute is a veritable projected war. It cannot be rushed. The public is understandably emotionally excited, but it does not have enough patience and stamina to drive home the point. It continued 3 days later. The more stretched out, okay, and complicated the dispute becomes, the more unbearable it would be for Japan, not China. And now finally, I'm off to my final strategy. And I guess perhaps counterintuitively, right? Counterintuitively as a strategy, a government may try to blur the identity boundary between the in-group and the out-group. It engages the in-group in what social psychologists call like superordinate recategorization. So that is, after a loss, the group distinction between us and them is transcended into a more inclusive we. The in-group's identity becomes less prominent, and as such, the damage done to its collective self-esteem becomes less acute and less damaging and threatening. Well, I didn't find this strategy much at work in the Diaoyu Island dispute, but I did find quite a bit of this happening in the other cases that I'm currently working on. So for instance, right, just to give, again, this is just an anecdote, right? In March 1939, as I'm sure many of you know, this famous period of history, Hitler pretty much ignored Britain's warning and invaded Czechoslovakia. And when Britain failed to follow up with any action, some of its ruling elites actually went out of their way to try to rationalize it, arguing how it would be a calamity if the quote like if the two races which are most akin, right, were to fight each other. So blurring the identity boundary between the British and the Germans, that would be an instance of superordinate recategorization. Another example I saw, again, this is really just very anecdotal, something I saw like in my day-to-day life reading up the news, right, would be how certain Chinese netizens reacted to Taiwan's performance in the recent Olympics. So when China won a gold against the Chinese Taipei team in ping pong, for instance, people were happy naturally, right? And some even commented, some more aggressive netizens even commented how they so-called like taught the forces of Taiwanese independence a lesson. But when they lost the game against the Taiwanese, I guess, and for some of us, I know there's a couple of you from Taiwan here, all right? I guess most memorably in the match for the gold medal in badminton men's double, some Chinese netizens were quick to obscure the significance of the loss by highlighting how they were, after all Chinese. So Taiwan's win would also be China's win. So to conclude, again, I think I'm running out of time. I'd like to make clear some of the implications of this research. So first, especially for IR, implications for IR. So first, if governments always have to some extent the leeway to make a loss to feel less like a loss, to wiggle their way out of a situation their citizens might otherwise interpret as a loss, then the assumption in IR that winning and losing is a straightforward experience is problematic, right? This might explain why, as some scholars have puzzled over recently, audience cost does not seem to be as forthcoming in many empirical cases as once assumed. And second, there's been a growing literature on how humiliation can be a cause of conflict in IR. So according to this literature, humiliation is more or less zero sum. A country's gain in status by humiliating another country is that other country's loss, and that's why they fight. However, my research would imply something different, right? It would imply that governments could have at their disposal certain social psychological tools, meaning the 10 social creative strategies I discussed, to soften the brunt of a humiliation, right? To make the target of a humiliation feel less bad about themselves. Humiliation then may not be so zero sum after all. That's for those of you, again, who are familiar with the true story of IQ. That's basically what IQ does, right? He's being humiliated, but then he doesn't actually feel it, right? Third, and some of you might be aware of this debate that's been going on, which is to what extent the Chinese state is actually able to shape and lead public opinion, right, in the realm of foreign policy, or on the contrary, is it mostly reacting passively to public opinion and being led by it? I don't have a definitive answer, but my research would imply that perhaps the balance of power between state and society would tip more in favor of the state rather than the other way around. Right? And finally, and perhaps most obviously, this research would contribute to our understanding of propaganda by looking at it from a psychological perspective, something that, as far as I know, hasn't been explored as much in the literature, at least the literature on propaganda in political science, in IR. Now, that said, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning of my presentation, this work is still very much, this project is still very much work in progress. There are a couple of things I intend to do moving forward. So first, I'm working on more case studies in relations to China, and to demonstrate that my theory has wider application beyond China and in authoritarian contexts. I also intend to look into several more cases involving India and other Western democracies. I also acknowledge that at the end of the day, my theory is about how propaganda works to affect an individual's collective self-esteem. But case studies, including the one I just presented on China and Japan, right, can only show that propaganda has happened. Strictly speaking, it cannot, quote unquote, prove, right, or show causally, right, or infer causally that it is really doing the work at the level of individual psychology. So to achieve that, we need to be creative, right, to use methods such as survey experiments. And that is what I also intend to do in the near future. So what you see here are screenshots of excerpts of a survey experiment I've been designing on Qualtrics, which hopefully I'll have it fielded for data collection again very soon. So I'd be happy to explain this line of research in greater detail in the Q&A. I think I'm out of time, so I'll just stop here. Thank you very much. Thanks for remaining attentive for like an hour. I'll pass the floor back to you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was a great presentation. I really like this area of research, and it kind of made me think about a lot of different things. The first thing that your talk reminded me of was I was reading some experts of Russian domestic politics who were very surprised by the invasion because they thought that the domestic political cost would be far too high for any such action. And then it made me think, perhaps they're using the theory you mentioned at the very beginning that would propose that losses are straightforwardly interpreted by publics, and that they just kind of assume that audiences will interpret a loss in the way that outsiders might interpret it, and they're not paying close enough attention to the possibilities of, all of the possibilities you mentioned for how a loss can be kind of reshaped and reimagined or reframed. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how perhaps diplomats might use this knowledge to more effectively propose peaceful solutions to conflicts such as these. Bringing up possibilities for an aggressor government to get their domestic public to accept what might otherwise be seen as a loss in negotiation. So do you think there's any opening there for diplomats to use these kinds of insights to try to convince people, their counterparts, to accept negotiating terms that they might otherwise view as losses, and say, hey, you can use these techniques to try to get your domestic public to look at it a different way?
So that's an interesting question. I thought at the beginning, when you were asking a question, I thought you were asking about, like, could diplomats use that as a strategy to convince their own people? So let's swallow this bitter fruit for now. In the long run, it will pay off. But then I realized you're actually talking about, like, could that be used as a bargaining tactic or bargaining, I don't know, like some kind of pitch, right, to your opponent, the other side of the negotiation table, and say, hey, you swallow this bitter pill, this bitter fruit now, but you could frame it this way, so to make it more palatable to your own people. I don't know. That's very interesting. I've never really thought about it. I don't know. I'm sure that's something worthy of exploring in the next step. I mean, and this is my current research. I'm really trying to take the first step, trying to understand how that could be used as a strategy for governments to use on its own people. But I don't know. Like, I mean, I know I could tell there are a couple of people from IR here who in the group. So if anyone else has to take, I don't want to deflect the question, but I really don't have a good answer to it.
Sorry, I should stop recording.